The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
It's welcome to the Forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. This morning we're talking about the agenda. We're talking about discourse here in South Africa. And ask the question, who sets the agenda? Whose discourse is this? Who sets the discourse? Whose worldview dominates the discourse in this country? Now, here's the background to this. A couple of months ago, Mr. AUBREY MATSHIQI said on this program that there is a cultural majority in this country, which may very well represent a numerical minority, whose worldview dominates the discourse. Mr. MATSHIQI is part of the panel here on the program this morning. AUBREY MATSHIQI, a very good morning. Thanks for your time.
Good morning, Pepeta. Thank you.
Also here with us this morning, FERIAL HAFAJEE. She is the editor-in-chief at City Press. Good morning. Nice seeing you. On the other line, we have Professor PIERRE, a lecturer of constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. Professor DeVos, good morning. Mr. MATSHIQI, what did you mean?
The answer to your question is both obvious and complex. Because if you always reduce the notion of cultural majorities and cultural minorities to race, you are likely to make some conceptual mistakes, and we can deal with that later. But what is important for now is the fact that the reason we participate in any discourse is with the aim of changing the world to our advantage. And if you look at the struggle against apartheid, the struggle against apartheid was also a struggle against liberation. So you have a coincidence between the struggle for liberation and the struggle against liberation, and the contending forces to some extent are still there.
Who constitutes this cultural majority? Is it simply a race issue, or are there other complex factors that are part of this cultural majority?
In South Africa, you have a political majority, and that political majority is essentially black. But if you look at the content of economic logic and other logics which govern South African life, it is not the worldview of this political majority that has become dominant. But you do find a convergence in the composition of this cultural majority of race and class. For instance, you and I, who belong to the middle class, are almost always, depending on the issue, part of this cultural majority. The question is, if we look at that convergence, are we therefore saying that the fact that those were colonizers in the past, those were architects of apartheid and benefited from apartheid in the past, are no longer a dominant part of this cultural majority? And the answer would be no, because the convergence between race and class sometimes mean we have become part of this cultural majority through assimilation. Others might argue that they have made a choice that is personal about which worldview is important to them. Sometimes they fool themselves in saying that, because sometimes what we internalize, we don't internalize consciously. And that is why, for instance, if you talk about representational discourses, such as the media, what you sometimes internalize is not conscious, and you therefore become, in the case of the media, you may become part of what Noam Chomsky called a system of propaganda.
Let me bring you in again on this one, FERIAL. Firstly, the phraseology, if one can use that word. Do you agree that there's a cultural majority that dominate the discourse in this country?
I'm trying to understand what AUBREY is saying, and I think we often speak in discussions like these from very rarefied heights, almost like ivory towers. So let me take two current examples. Say the issue of the Judicial Service Commission hearings, perhaps the Boston bombings, and then the representation of women in the judiciary. Three areas. I believe that by reading our media, because I believe the media is the staging post for the problem that AUBREY suggests we have in South Africa. I've read the full spectrum of opinion from a full range of South Africans, black, white, numerous classes. Let me point out something else, just a tangible example rather, of the JSE hearings. I was very concerned that I was only hearing one part of the debate, how white men were being excluded from appointment to the judiciary. So I set out very hard with my colleagues to go and find black people who would speak the other side of the story. Very hard to do. The Chief Justice wouldn't give us an interview. And this is not just a one-off. Common problem I have. Therefore, who owns the space and who doesn't take opportunity to own that space is, I think, something we have to look.
Professor Voss, in any event, some may argue that it's not a uniquely South African issue, that there are dominant worldviews, not just here but elsewhere as well.
Well, I agree firstly mostly with AUBREY MATSHIQI, and I think that it is true that anywhere in the world, as I understand it at least, a society has certain master narratives, as I would call it. There are certain stories that we tell ourselves and which all the events we try to fit into that story. And in South Africa, like any other country, that is also the case. But what makes it difficult here is that we are firstly a society in flux. We're busy with radical changes in our society, and we're also a society that is extremely diverse. And so there's going to be jostling for control of this master narrative, if you will. And I think that the problem is that we don't always know, or we don't always realize that we are implicated in it. So that's why I would disagree with FERIAL when she says that this is not the case. I think, it's like being in the ocean and not realizing that you're actually swimming in water because you're a fish, and you don't realize that you're in the water because that's the only thing you know. And I think it's important that we should have these discussions and say who gets to speak, who gets to listen to. I know that if I was living in a rural village in the Eastern Cape, nobody would listen to me. The fact that I'm white, that I'm middle class, that I have a certain educational way of, background and so on, all those things make it possible for me to speak and to be listened to and to be taken seriously by those people who make decisions about these things. And I think we need to think about that and be critical about ourselves and also self-reflexive about these things. When we engage in the space.
Let me come down from my ivory towers for a moment.
Just for us mere journalists.
That in the existence of a master narrative, there are counter narratives. Does not mean the master narrative no longer exists. You have many voices, you have many opinions, but the same dominant perspective. Who are the voices? The voice in the discourse in South Africa is male, dominantly white male. So at that level, there is also a convergence between race and gender, because the voice that is dominant at another level is the voice of the black and white male. The voice of the female, particularly the non-middle class female, is marginalized from the discourse. The poor are talked about. They don't talk to us about their lived reality. We talk about their lived reality, about their lived reality in their absence. So, starting with the fact that there is a dominant worldview, I can even go further and say the dominant worldview in South Africa, as in many parts of the world, is a Western modernist worldview.
Now let's go to the lines before we... maybe we should start with SMSs. Somebody says the same argument can be said about the Zulus and the Xhosas who want to dominate other groupings in the country. I'm not sure if Mr. MATSHIQI will want to respond to that. It's the voices of those who were dispossessed that should dictate, not the Washington consensus that uses the minority who own this country and the ANC taking the advantage of the ignorance of the majority. That's Kosi Maqatuga on SMS. Another one says the cultural minority, also known as central banksters, have control over the issuance of money. That's what's colonized Africa and the world. Let's take Mvusi in the Eastern Cape. My guest will respond again. Mvusi, good morning.
Perpetual, good morning to you and your guest.
Welcome.
Just to appreciate Mr. MATSHIQI's high level of intellectual explanation of situation. I think we agreeing with him. We need to understand the fact that from inception, the media, which now influences public discourse, was set up as a political ideological tool. And that pattern has been going on ever since. And I think, unfortunately, FERIAL represents, whether knowingly or unknowingly, the commercial sector of South African economy that wants to determine things outside the political spectrum. We can't run away from the fact that our country is a political country, and as such, we need to attend to issues politically, but by working with all these other sectors. I think it's very important to remember what Gramsci said, that leadership is not about cohesion. Leadership is about encouraging everybody to participate and involving people, canvassing their opinions. I think the media is really letting us down in many aspects.
Right, that's Mvusi in Eastern Cape. Thanks indeed. FERIAL will respond to you in a minute. Numbulelo Kimberley. Good morning, Numbulelo.
Hi, Golani.
Yeah, hi. Welcome, Numbulelo.
Yeah, what Mr. MATSHIQI is saying is very true, and it is evidenced by you also every morning. Whenever you discuss this day in history, you never give us an Afrocentric worldview. You're always referring to something that happened in Europe or America. So it seems that our history even is dominated by Eurocentric events.
Well, it may not necessarily be accurate, and I must defend myself. Even this morning we were talking about some former apartheid minister. I'm not sure what you're talking about, Numbulelo, which is South African.
But what about other African countries on the continent? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I suppose there are questions to be asked. There are questions to be asked.
India or Asia, for that matter.
Right. Numbulelo and Kimberley, thank you. I really have got to thank you all for your time this morning. Fantastic discussion. FERIAL HAFAJEE, Editor-in-Chief at City Press. Thank you.
Lovely
Good
to
see
be
you.
with you.
Thanks indeed. And also, AUBREY MATSHIQI, political analyst as well as a fellow at the Helen Suzman Foundation. Always a pleasure. Thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Professor PIERRE, lecturer of constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. I thank you for your time as well. And thanks indeed for listening to the program. Thank you for the SMSs, emails, as well as calls.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.